So without further ado, we are really fortunate to have two spectacular speakers tonight, both of whom are coming off very exciting moments in their careers or what they've been up to recently. I don't think either of them probably knew how busy this week would be when they agreed to do this a few months ago, so I'm especially appreciative that given the context, they both agreed to come and join us tonight. Our main speaker tonight is Simon Greer. Simon Greer is 15 days, he reminded me a few times today as I asked him all sorts of questions about his new job, into his role as the president of the Nathan Cummings Foundation, the leading foundation rooted in Jewish tradition and committed to democratic values and social justice. He is also the outgoing president and CEO of the Progressive Jewish Alliance and the Jewish Funds for Justice. He did all sorts of amazing things in his work at Jewish Funds for Justice. I won't read the entire bio, but I will say that over dinner we heard some really fascinating stories about his work last year in a campaign to help push Glenn Beck off the airwaves, and maybe he'll mention a little bit about that tonight. But it was quite interesting. I was very impressed with the campaign just watching it from afar, but hearing a little bit more about the backstory tonight was fascinating when you get a sense of all of the strategic thinking that went into that national campaign. In addition to Simon, we're lucky to have literally straight off the plane from South Carolina, where he was helping to cover the primary elections for the Seattle Times, UW professor David Domke. He's professor and chair of the communications department. As those applause indicate, Professor Domke is one of the most popular professors at the University of Washington. In addition to this lecture tonight, he'll also be giving a series of lectures, the President Lecture, some big deal lecture at the University of Washington next few weeks. So if you like him tonight, you can tell all your friends you saw him first at the Jewish Studies lecture, and I encourage you to hear him speak some more. Professor Domke wrote his last book is called The God Strategy, which won an outstanding Book of the Year award, and he is, as I said before, been elected as one of the favorite professors at the university. And if you saw those pictures that were up a few minutes ago, you could see some of his pictures right up in the face of Mitt and Newt and the rest of the I don't know what to call them, cast of characters who are working their way through the primaries in South Carolina. So and the rest of the country. Without further ado, I am going to ask Simon to introduce himself briefly, and then David, and then their conversation will take it from there. Enjoy.
Great. Are we on? Is it working? Sounds like it, yeah. So anyway, thanks for having me. It's nice to be here. It's raining. And everybody has gear. Like I showed up in this, and at lunch everyone has like their rain thing and their bike pants, the whole thing. But when it snows, you're kind of outgunned. So it's nice to be here. I just wanted to say, so I was trained as a community organizer. It's really all I was ever trained as. No one ever really knew what that meant. My mom used to say, it's like you help people make their closets more organized. And I'm not sure after the 2008 election anyone understands anymore what it is, except that our president did it too. So that changed things a little for me. But I just, as an organizer, you're taught like always start with stories. Like, who are you and why do you care? So just want to do a really quick 2-minute. I was born in New York City on the Upper West Side. My parents were raised Orthodox in the East End of London. They moved to America in 1965. When they arrived, basically they fled their relationship to Judaism. So I had a bar mitzvah. It was at home because my parents wouldn't set foot in a synagogue. I knew I was proud that we were Jewish, but I didn't know much more about it. I went to Jewish Communist summer camp. My bunk was called Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney. So, and like in the Camp Olympics, you know, like you blue versus gray is what most camps do. We did nations in anti-colonial struggle. So I was on the Ivory Coast one year. I was on Vietnam one year. This was like, you know, and after Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney, I got promoted into Paul Robeson. So that was sort of, those are the politics that I grew up on. My dad always says I was marinated in social justice. I left, I went to college, I left, and I moved to Poland. It's like to work I graduated in 1990. The Berlin Wall had come down. It seemed very significant given my family's politics. So I moved to Poland, try to understand what was going on. I stopped in London on my way to see my grandmother, who was like, now hold on. It takes everything we've got to get out of Poland. Your father moves to America, you go to some fancy college, and now you're going back to Poland? So I did. I went back. I lived there for about 2 years. I worked for Lech Wałęsa when they took over the country. I can tell more about that if it's worth it later. I came home. I did the obvious next thing, which I moved to South Carolina, and I got a job as a community organizer and then a union organizer. Eventually moved to Washington, D.C., and if anyone's interested, I can give you the blow-by-blow of that whole journey. But by about 1997, I was focused on whether Judaism and social justice had anything to do with each other. I knew they were personally motivating and intertwined for me, and I kept meeting people who didn't think they were connected, and I wanted to understand this. And so my professional career took a series of turns that resulted in the last 7 years of me doing the two things I never thought I would do. I was a professional Jew and a foundation executive. The last two things that I imagined doing, my son says now, he's 3, that he wants to be a cook, and I say, a chef? And he says, no, Daddy, a cook. But in his off time, he wants to be an elevator operator. And I think that I was probably more in the cook elevator operator plan than the Jewish professional foundation executive, but here we are. So that's just a quick little bit of context about me so you know who's up here talking. I've come to believe that when you tie Judaism and social justice together, you can do something truly magical for yourself, for the Jewish community, and for the world we want to create. So 15 years later, I think it matters, but I have days where I doubt it. So that's me, and I really look forward to the conversation. Dave.
Wow, that's fascinating, Simon. Simon's the main event tonight, and I'm here to kind of facilitate a question and answer and to ask you some questions. My quick background is I'm a professor at the University of Washington. I'm in the communication department, and I study American politics and news coverage. Very interested in the political strategies that people in office or those who want to be in office utilize to shape public opinion and to shape news coverage. In the last 10 years since 9/11, I've been particularly interested in the images of America and within that a subset area of the kind of the religious emphases that dominate American politics. That has led me to be interested in the rise of conservative Christian emphases and the increasing thrust on the political side of using religious themes for political advantage, political purposes. And so this is what I'm interested in. I was marinated to some degree in that growing up, raised in a kind of Catholic tradition in the Midwest, and then my wife is a pastor now, and faith is an important part of our lives. But we've also seen it from a variety of perspectives. And so we have ears to hear, to use a metaphor, of these kind of discourses that I study. And at the same time, we also have enough experiences to be, as democratic citizens, deeply concerned about those emphases. So I come neither as someone who wants to remove religion from the American political sphere, although I see it abused in many ways, nor do I want it necessarily emphasized from the American political sphere, because on both, I can see value and challenges on both sides of that. And on a pure realistic perspective, there would be no way to remove it from the American political sphere. It's a part of the DNA of this culture. And I study these kind of things. I study them in how people talk, how they communicate, the speeches they deliver, the ads they cut, the news coverage that journalists put forward. And that's just kind of what I'm obsessed about. So if I wasn't here in front of you, I'd be looking at my Twitter feed right now to figure out what people are saying about the State of the Union address, or Mitt Romney's taxes, or what Newt Gingrich is doing, the fact that he drew 3,000 people to a Sarasota rally today. All of those pieces are what interest me. And I just returned Sunday evening from a week in South Carolina with 6 of my students covering that campaign there, trying to understand kind of at the ground zero of American evangelicalism and politics in the United States. So I'm fascinated that you spent 4 years in South Carolina, because I spent a week, and that was good. And so let me start, Simon, with this question maybe. There's so much to unpack in your story. You gloss over many different pieces there, but I study the political communication strategies that are utilized with the belief that those strategies are utilized to activate, mobilize the people that you're working with or that you've worked with. But I don't have a great handle on what's going on with those people on the ground, the citizens, the ones who we saw at Columbia First Baptist when we went to church, all my students and I, where the secession documents were signed in 1861. We went there on a Sunday to talk to them as part of our experience there. So maybe you could talk a little bit about, to start us off, what are some of the kind of traditions or ways in which religion has come into the American political and public sphere, and along the way maybe pass a few moral judgments on these approaches. Yeah.
Happily. One of the ways I like to think about this, David, is I have a half-sister who's 20 years younger than me, and I grew up thinking that religious meant progressive. So the anti-nuclear movement, the anti-apartheid movement, the civil rights movement, this was many, many people coming out of a faith tradition or committed from their faith values. That's what I thought as a kid. She, 20 years later, understands it almost as the inverse.
Exactly opposite.
That if you're religious, you are conservative. And so that didn't just sort of happen by chance. That was a project that a group of, I think, very strategic and I would say somewhat mean-spirited financiers decided that this mattered in American politics. And today, I just was actually at this briefing yesterday, there are 30 states where conservative Christians have not a full lock on the politics, but are a fundamental building block to any electoral strategy in that place. So they've succeeded, they've married together sort of I would say, faux libertarian strategy with a extreme conservative Christian strategy in a strange alliance that for the time being is holding. So what underneath all that, what's really happening? I'm really struck by 40 years ago, 50 years ago, in the civil rights movement, you would have found, it's a heavily religious movement, right? It was a Baptist movement in many ways, grounded in the black church, and there were Jews all over the place. But they wouldn't have spoken much about being Jews. They would have been heavily secular, many sort of ideologically left, but they wouldn't have brought their Jewish religious practice into Southern Baptist churches. You roll forward 40, 50 years, and the religion is no longer a force for progressivism in our country. By and large, it's a force for conservatism. This very secular movement, Occupy Wall Street, comes bursting on the scenes, and the Jews, I don't know if you've seen these images, are in the streets bringing Jewish religious practice to a secular movement. So, Kol Nidre, like Yom Kippur, 1,000 Jews at Occupy Wall Street in New York City. There's no religious element to this movement, the way civil rights was deeply religious, but the Jews are like bringing Simchas Torah and Sukkot, like bringing deep Jewish practice. It's a real turnaround. I think it's also worth saying, though, that the Jewish involvement in civil rights, so to my way of thinking, and there may be people here who have more firsthand experience with it than me, for sure. I wasn't born until 68. There's a romanticizing we do about the Jewish involvement in civil rights. It's like, yes, it was a heyday of Jewish involvement in the civil rights movement and progressive causes. And certainly it was a proud day. And I was asking some people at lunch today, right before Martin Luther King gave the I Have a Dream speech, Rabbi Prince from the American Jewish Congress was the speaker before the keynote. That's a big, the Jews were doing something, right? That the civil rights movement leadership thought, you want to give a rabbi the role right before Dr. King gives his home run speech. But there's also some complication about that time that I think is worth mentioning. So there are Jews all over the civil rights movement. But I like to think there were 3 Jews at the March on Washington. One, sort of the left perspective, race struggle is the forefront of class struggle, that's why I'm here. The second is the kind of prophetic, I like to call them sort of Holocaust universalist. So we know what it's like to be strangers in a strange land, to be dehumanized, to be disrespected. We won't stand idly by while that happens to other people. But there was a third group of Jews, which is pretty important for understanding our politics in the moment and today, who I would call more the self-interested or country club Jews. So in Baltimore, up until much more recently than the civil rights movement, there were country clubs in Baltimore that said no blacks or no Negroes, no dogs, and no Jews. there were gentlemen's agreements that kept you from owning property in certain neighborhoods and covenants that set quotas on how many Jews could go to certain colleges and universities. So there were Jews in the civil rights movement not just out of this righteous religious tradition, this prophetic tradition, but also out of a common bond with African Americans that we also were being excluded. And I think, although it's like we like to think that it was just a purely generous spirit that put us there, it's important for thinking about Jewish politics today to remember that the Jewish politics have never been pure, clean, and simple. And certainly they've only grown more complicated over the last 40 or so years.
Is there a dominant strain today in the public arena for Jewish politics in the United States?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of what I've tried to work on the last 7 years is changing this. There is if your last name happens to be Goldstein, and you get a piece of mail from someone running for office, it probably says Israel in really big letters, at least a dozen times in that piece of mail, because the dominant strategy is pander to the Jews on Israel. The truth of the matter is, and we can talk more about this, whether you like the organization J Street or not, they conducted a poll at the exit poll, the 2010, the midterm elections. Right? This is an Israel organization. And the conclusion was that like 83% of Jewish voters didn't vote based on Israel. So what is going on that politicians still believe that you pander to the Jews on Israel politics, but most Jewish voters leave the voting booth and they say, it's about the economy, it's about Medicare and Medicaid and public education, it's the things that it's about for most Americans. This gap, right, is to me the sort of strange irony on what is the dominant trend or theme in American Jewish politics.
Is there a distinct, in your perspective, Jewish identity in the American public sphere? So, because I know that there is a distinct white evangelical conservative perspective. There is, that they are pro-life on issues of abortion and euthanasia, that they are anti-same-sex marriage, that they are family values voters, they are traditional male breadwinner value. These are distinct identity pieces that define you as in the club or not in the club. If it's not Israel, then are there other pieces that say you're in the club as a Jewish publicly engaged person in the United States?
Yeah, no, it's such an interesting question. I mean, I think in a way what happened over a period of time, probably early 70s to early 90s, was that a split happened among individual Jews, that those who chose to identify more Jewishly in their public identification tended to then have a more parochial or more Israel-focused sort of political habit. And the Jews who opted for a more, quote, progressive politics moved away from their Jewish identity. When I took my last job 7 years ago, we thought the actual opportunity was that increasingly Jewish organizations were reserving their political capital for foreign affairs and not speaking out on domestic issues. And scores, I mean hundreds of thousands of Jews were still polling as the most liberal, predominantly white group in America. But Jewish organizations weren't talking about those things. So it seemed like an opportunity to step in and say there is a progressive Jewish politics on the domestic front that could capture the hearts and minds of many, many Jewish people and remind America that the Jewish community has always stood for something in this country. And I think that effort, in a way, is still fledgling. And I think I can talk a little more about our campaign against Glenn Beck, because it brought some of this to bear. But in July, we took 170 Jewish leaders to the White House for a day of sort of issue briefing and policy debate purely on domestic issues. And to say it sent shockwaves through the organized Jewish community that a bunch of upstart groups could take 170 people to the White House, that the organized Jewish community didn't know about it, wasn't asked to make it happen or not make it happen, and that they didn't talk about Israel, was like a shock.
Could I stop you just to back you up just a little bit? So you're talking about something that I'm not familiar with. There's the establishment organizations, and then there's these upstart could you unpack that just a little bit?
Yeah, so there's a set of, and there's a large universe maybe of Jewish organizations that have been around for a good amount of time. They fall generally into three camps, I would say. One is the universe of defense organizations, so the Anti-Defamation League, the American Jewish Congress, used to be also the American Jewish Committee. They were founded about 100 years ago. to defend Jewish lives, really.
Okay.
There's a second universe, the Federation system, right, which is in most communities, there's a Jewish Federation that helps raise money for Jewish communal agencies in that region, and then the denominations or the movements and the synagogues of Judaism, right? So Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, Reconstructionist. Those tend to be considered the establishment organizations.
Okay.
And then over the last really 25 years, but most intensely the last 10 years, about 20 organizations have emerged. There are actually two movements that are probably worth mentioning. About 20 organizations that focus on Jewish social justice, that say you don't have to either do Jewish over here or social justice over here. You know, it's like Reese's peanut butter cups, your chocolate and my peanut butter, that you can do the two things together and they're actually better. That's one important movement, because typically the split had been, I think what we saw in the 70s and 80s and into the 90s was that, as I said, Jews who wanted a more Jewish agenda stayed with those establishment organizations, and other Jews left and went to the Sierra Club or to Move On or wherever they went. These organizations said you don't have to make that choice. There's one other, I think, for this conversation, very important trend. There's this emerging movement of independent Jewish spiritual communities. You have one here, right here in Seattle, that have grown up outside of the context of synagogue, but they have reclaimed Jewish ritual, and I would say Jewish spirituality, and a commitment to social justice. And I think those two movements are changing the face of how Jews, so I think the Occupy Wall Street stuff that I mentioned is partly because Jews, over a decade or more, an infrastructure has been built that Jews can own their Jewish values, their politics, and their interest in spirituality or ritual, and do them all together. And I think the infrastructure didn't exist for that, and in a way the market didn't exist for it a decade ago. People didn't know you could have it. And it's a whole new way of doing Jewish politics that I think will really change. Can I digress for a second? Why don't I digress for a second?
Yeah.
So we ran this campaign against Glenn Beck, and I won't do all the gory details, but the takeaway was liberal Jews communicated to mainstream Jews, who communicated to conservative Jews, who communicated to conservative Christians, who communicated to movement conservatives, who ultimately got Glenn Beck off the air.
Yeah.
And had you gone liberal Christians to conservative Christians to say Glenn Beck is bad for Christianity or for conservatism, you would have been laughed at, right? So great people like Jim Wallace from Sojourners never could have done it. But when Commentary Magazine reaches out to Pat Buchanan and says, this anti-Semitism at Fox is unacceptable, suddenly Pat Buchanan, right, is on TV talking about why Glenn Beck is a liability for movement conservatives. That development in Jewish politics, right, is, I think, totally untested for what the potential is. But certainly as you get this hyper-polarized country and you get a block of Christian voters, the role of Jews who have legitimacy to engage Christians around values, and Jews who are more comfortable doing that, it's a really interesting wedge and I think a complex political terrain.
Yeah, so I'm going to come back and ask you about that meeting at the White House in a second. But Simon and I think, realized something when the introductions were being made, that you had done the work against Glenn Beck involved with you were tied to a media organization called Media Matters, right? Mm-hmm. And Media Matters is a watchdog organization for news coverage. It tracks 24/7 content on cable particularly, but all the networks. And I've done a couple grants with them through the University of Washington, and we were about to get a grant from them to do a thorough content analysis of Beck's work relative to other sites on the internet, because you were trying to track. We were going to look at Nazi rhetoric, for example, right, that was on his show. And then all of us, so I was very excited about this, my students were all excited about it, but then you were so successful, you booted Beck out before we got to it. And I made my case about why they should still do it, but Media Matters was moving on, and so we never got to it. So I'm a little upset with you about that. It's, but in the big picture, I'm thrilled with that. And I'm interested to the extent to which the how it is you got to Media Matters to talk to, because were you going to fund that? Was your group going to be the ones that were going to fund that?
Yeah, no, what happened was, I guess, I'm going to mess up, I won't try to do all the dates, but at some point Glenn Beck said that if your church is involved in social justice, you should turn in your pastor,
right,
and you should run from that church. And the Jewish Funds for Justice had for 25 years funded in church, heavily in churches, synagogues as well, but had funded people doing social justice work in their churches. And so we decided it was an opportunity to sort of step in and say something about this. And we did it by kind of lampooning Glenn Beck. We created this website called Haiku Glenn Beck, and people were able to tweet haikus about Glenn Beck, right, mocking him a little bit. He jumped in and did this whole thing about how, we actually coined a phrase, we called it a Twitter storm. So we tweeted him one haiku every minute for 24 hours, which got him to lash out. And then I did an op-ed about the common good, and he said the common good is what led to the death camps in Nazi Germany, and Simon Greer, a Jew, should know better. And at that point, I think we realized we had him on terrain that he didn't understand.
Yeah.
Right? Like, you can say a lot of things in America, but you can't blame Jews for the Holocaust. Like, it crosses a line. And when we said, I wrote to Rupert Murdoch raising this, and he set up a meeting with Roger Ailes, who met with us and got a signed letter from Glenn Beck to me explaining why they didn't really mean what we thought they meant. And roll forward, they then they quieted it down. It had been something like 400 references to Hitler, Holocaust, and Nazi in the first 18 months of the Obama administration. And they calmed down after our meeting, and then they attacked George Soros with this reference to the puppet master. They called him a puppet master and showed him doing this, and we put out a video that scanned white supremacist websites with the puppet master imagery, right, and quotes from the Protocols of the Elders of Zion about Jews as the puppet masters, and asked, like, why is Fox News, right? So, and this just sent them into a spiral. And so what was really interesting is that Fox News cares about its Jewish viewers. Sort of, I hadn't understood how much they cared and how much Rupert Murdoch cared about the Jewish circle of influence around him. And then we, I'll tell this little inside story. On Holocaust Remembrance Day, we ran an ad in the Wall Street Journal, Rupert Murdoch's paper, 400 rabbis condemning Roger Ailes and Glenn Beck for their misappropriation of Holocaust imagery. I told some of you this at dinner. So on Monday of that week, we submitted the ad and it was accepted. On Tuesday, we learned that Rupert Murdoch had called the publisher of the Wall Street Journal to say, pull the ad. And on Tuesday night, the publisher responded that it met the criteria for ads in the journal and they wouldn't be pulling it. And so it ran on Thursday. And Beck then said they were only Reform rabbis, and Reform Judaism is akin to fanatical Islam, right? It's a purely political movement. Right? So he had skated onto ice, like he had no idea what he was doing. And ultimately, a few weeks later, he lost his show. And I think for us, our involvement was that Media Matters, the organization you mentioned, they actually, what's shocking is that Glenn Beck and folks like that used to do this stuff, on Fox, and most of us wouldn't watch it, so you didn't know what he was doing. And then he would echo a more extreme version on the radio, and no one was following it. So it was like two different realities. Ours, which I think some have some standard of decency, and this other one where he is spewing hate, and no one's tracking it, and so he's never held to account. What Media Matters created was a vehicle. They have this amazing, it's a room like this with TVs and monitors and people just watching all of this right-wing stuff, tracking it, and then sending it to organizations that can do something about it. So we were ultimately interested in, when we didn't think we were going to succeed so quickly, trying to show that he was totally out of the mainstream of how Fox's coverage is.
So those kind of partnerships that you had to build to pressure Beck, Fox, Ailes, Murdoch, and the partnerships that would bring you to the White House with this group of 170 or something you mentioned organizations. What's the political / philosophical goal here? What are you driving for? So you got Beck off the air. Okay, great. He's a mean-spirited man. We could go on. That's great. You took these people to the White House. What's the goal of all of this in your work?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good question. For me, and maybe the goals are in two dimensions. So I certainly, I mentioned my parents came to this country in 1965. Rent-controlled housing, free education at City University of New York, unemployment insurance when my mom was out of work, and a shopkeeper on the corner of 85th and West End who would let us buy on credit. Like, those things allowed us to make it. My parents grew up in poverty in England and ended up doing very well here. And my mom, before my mom passed away, she used to say, we should love America because it's the only country in the world where that journey is possible. And we should be angry that it's so out of reach for so many people. And I think I grew up on those politics, right? That no one is a self-made man or self-made woman, right? It is the nation that we invest in that allows people like my parents to come here with nothing and pull themselves up, right? Not by their bootstraps, but by the infrastructure that we invest in, that we pay taxes to provide for one another. And we're a nation at a crossroads. Right? We have a choice about which America we will be. And so that's sort of the one dimension. And then I feel like what I learned when I started this job was that was my Jewish story, but it's our community's story. Not that everybody in the Jewish community has made it by any stretch, but we came to this country, we weren't the most oppressed people, but we weren't the most welcome. And we fought to find our place in America, and ultimately, after resistance, America was receptive. We helped build the movements, we helped build the institutions, the Mount Sinai hospitals, the city college systems. Like, we helped build a more inclusive America. The sort of promise of America was also a promise of Judaism. And so one dimension is about America, the other is about this community. And will we be the people who, having benefited from those things and enhanced them, will now turn our back on the other people who come to this country hoping for the same things that we got? Or will we know that your values are sort of only as significant as the way you live them when you don't really have to? Like, if you could buy your way out of your value system, they're not really values. So today, do we still live those values? And I think the agenda for me, the reason I took the job 7 years ago and this new job now was that, and it's so poignant to me now for two reasons. One is, fair enough, progressive tax policy hasn't been on the agenda for the last 7 years, gross income inequality not on the agenda, so fine, the Jewish community hasn't been a leader in putting it on the agenda, but it hasn't been on the agenda. So it's now on the agenda. And will our community sort of duck and cover? Or will we say, we have a position, we have a belief system, long before America was debating these issues, we've been thinking about these issues and we have something to offer. So for me, there is a real Jewish agenda in that, and then I can't help, but we were talking about our kids, I just can't help think, like I have a 3-month-old and a 3-year-old, and I just wonder, like, when they ask me, like, we had a black president, and what did you do, Dad? Like, will my answer be duck and cover? Will my answer be, wow, at the most important moment in my lifetime, the American Jewish community said, oh, right, we have a value system, and it is not pretty every day to figure out how to live these values, but we will. And I think, so for me, that's the second dimension, is the Jewish dimension in the context of America grappling with making good on its commitments.
So let's take that opportunity then to pivot to talk about that president a little bit, and to ask you a couple questions about President Barack Obama and the United States Jewish community and Israel a little bit, and talk about that. So how would you classify yourself? Are you in the disillusioned leftist community about this president? Are you in the community that sees no flaws in this president? Are you in the nuanced mixed middle group that thinks he has done a decent job but not as good a job as he could have done? How would you characterize that relative to your Jewish identity?
Mm-hmm. So I guess in the spirit of full disclosure, I was on sabbatical last winter, a year ago tonight in essence. I went down and I worked at the White House for a number of months, and I have been back almost every month to work with the Office of Public Engagement, not just on Jewish stuff, but on general, how do they engage the organized constituent groups. So just so it's out there. I've never been on the payroll, but I've spent a fair amount of time there. And what kept happening last year, so I would, I had a very young child, I would fly down to Washington or take the train down on a Monday morning, and I'd be totally immersed. These people work like like 18-hour days. So I would just work all the time. I'd come back Thursday night and start to talk to my family, and my family would start telling me everything that the administration is doing wrong. And in essence, why the people I'm related to are smarter than everybody who works for the president. And that I should just tell them, if he would just do this on foreclosures, and couldn't he, on gay marriage, can't he just, and I'd go back and I'd sort of sit there and I'd, follow these conversations, like like we're watching on TV as they're saying he's not being, this was during Egypt, right? He's not being strong enough. And then he's in the Oval Office on the phone with Mubarak, like reading him the Riot Act. And then he walks out and he gives a very polished, poised speech. And I'd go home and my family's like, what is wrong with the president? He's not leading. And so, this is, the things I'm going to say about the Jewish community in Israel may be the least popular part of what I say. But before we get there, like, I love this president. I think this guy is, thank you, one person. Well, it was worth coming to Seattle just to see you. I love the guy.
She's from Portland, probably. Okay.
I think if we were a group of conservatives and he had done on the conservative agenda what he has done on the liberal agenda, we would have chiseled a new person in Mount Rushmore. Like, we would be loving this guy. He would be like the Messiah. I mean, he has delivered far beyond what I could even believe would be possible with the cards he was dealt. And instead, we just glass half empty, glass half empty, glass half empty. And there are just two things about him that I really want to say. Well, maybe it's three. So one is this, like, I don't know what it is about, like, I don't know if it's about liberals or about people who've been through, like, psychoanalysis. Like, we're Jews, like, we're trying to analyze him. Oh, he's by nature a compromiser. He starts every conversation at the 50-yard line. You can like what he did with Osama bin Laden or not. But just, like, if you haven't focused in on the details, he was in the Situation Room. He gave this very bold order to kill that man and sent in extra helicopters to get it done. He went out to the press's annual roast. He cracked like 6 jokes in perfect timing. He walked back into the Situation Room and they watched him kill Osama bin Laden. He is not a compromiser. He may be shrewd and he may be cold-hearted, but he's not a compromiser. And he's very good friends with this guy, Mike Stratmanis, who was his legal counsel when he was a senator. And they're close to best friends. And Mike's a little bit younger than me, probably the youngest, almost best friend of a president ever in our history, just because of how young. So I asked Mike one night over a drink, who do you talk to? He said, when your best friend's the president of the United States, you don't talk to anybody. And he said, but I want to tell you the story. He said, when the senator came to me and said, I'm going to run for president, I looked at him and I was like, okay, Senator, if you say so. And he said, well, a lot of people don't like George Bush, and a lot of other people don't like Hillary Clinton, and John Edwards has no discipline. I think I can win. Interesting. And Mike said, fair enough, Senator, if that's what you want to do. And he said, but don't get confused. This is not the end of the 30-year project to rebuild a progressive movement. This is a tactical opportunity. And I feel like he is playing a long game, and we need to, like, get with that program. Right? He wasn't swept in on a progressive movement that rushed him into power. He built the movement. Like, we didn't have a progressive movement, and he got elected, and then he had a Tea Party. And we what did we do? And so I love the guy. I think he is smart. He does not aim to score rhetorical points. He won't do it. Like, he will not give a lecture on what the Republicans should be doing. He'll just stay the course and try to get it done. And I think he's great. Now, of course, there are things I wish he could have done better, of course. But when I think about the many fronts that he's dealing with. So what's interesting about him for Jews is that he's engaged. Did anyone go to the URJ, the Reform Movement's biennial? It's a little bit esoteric. No? One? Yes! Great. So you watched his speech on YouTube? So there's this phrase.
What is URJ, please?
The URJ, sorry, is the Reform Movement, the largest denomination of Judaism, Union of Reform Judaism, and they have a biennial, their convention. And the president spoke there this year.
Okay.
And he gave, it would be really interesting actually for your research, he gave this speech. There's this saying, somebody's going to do a better job translating it, but I would translate it, it's like, here I am, hineni, right? It means here I am. So he gives this speech, right? It's this here I am speech, right? And he first of all, like, he starts off by talking about his daughter going to bar and bat mitzvahs, and the debate about how long a skirt you have to wear, and right. So he's like very good at working the crowd, and then he says hineni, and he talks about everything he's accomplished on the domestic agenda where he has been there on the issues we care about. And what I thought was so different was that a previous president would have only spoken about Israel. Right? This president is trying to connect to us on the domestic issues that he believes we have in common. And actually, when I saw him at the Hanukkah party, I said to him, at the end of the day, the Jews finally care about what happens in this country. And he said, I know that. And I said, and we'll be there for you. And he said, and I'm counting on it. So I think he has challenged our community, the portions of the community that have a view that the Israeli government is our friend, right or wrong, in all circumstances. And he said that's not a road to security nor a road to peace, and so he won't tolerate it. Right? He's right. It's not a road to peace and security. So it's a short-term strategy to protect what we have, but it's not a long game, and he plays the long game. So
I want to ask you about the Republican candidates here in a second, so you can think about that. But I'm working on a book right now with a colleague of mine on Barack Obama, and it's looking at these new kind of models of exceptionalism that he's putting forward, and they're quite challenging to traditional models of American exceptionalism. It isn't that he's walked away from American exceptionalism, but he has a different way of thinking about it. It's a far more inclusive model of exceptionalism than others have offered. And one of the chapters is about the three Abrahamic faiths, looking at the way in which he's put Judaism and Islam on the same rhetorical plane as Christianity in this country. And no president has ever linked those three together in the way that this president has. He consistently, in his speeches, will talk about them together, the three of them together. And it's just unprecedented for presidents. And when he goes overseas, he does it all the time. He quotes from the Quran and from the Talmud and then from the Bible. The Bible. He does all this on a regular basis. And it's very interesting, and we think that part of our argument is how that has deeply offended conservative evangelicals. The idea that Christianity would be on the same plane as others, right? And without doing too much psychoanalysis of him, because I don't kind of think that's ever really that valuable to do, it does fit with his kind of identity, the identities in which he's been raised, the different perspectives he's been around. So what about on the Republican side of things? Is there anybody there that you would say that anybody in this room, on any particular issues maybe, should give a serious hearing to?
I'm trying to believe in the best in people. Well, I'm going to cheat a little. When we did this Beck campaign, I got very interested in the people, we called it organizing the Tea Party base, very interested in the people who were watching Fox. And the mistake we make that, like, we can mock Glenn Beck, but we shouldn't mock the people who are watching, because they're doing it for some good reason, right? Mm-hmm. Someone's not speaking to them, they're angry about something, and for good reason. Right? And I feel similarly with these candidates, that I think they've both been, deceptive and in some ways dishonest, and I just disagree with their sort of prescription. I think it's true when the president says, we won't go back to the strategies that got us here as a way to get us out, and that I think the Republican candidates, and I actually think in a way it's a tragedy. Like, part of my hesitation, my pause was, I would like there to be a good debate, like a healthy, honest debate. It would be good for our politics. And this block, like, who was saying to me at lunch that there's a Republican candidate for governor here who may be a decent candidate or could be a good governor and might have the potential to move into national politics. And I think the tragedy is that candidate would evaporate and to be replaced by a fanatic to play in national politics in the Republican Party, because it's a broken party. Right? And so, I mean, Mitt Romney is doing backflips against the very things that he supported in Massachusetts that he claims are his successes, but he can't claim them, right? He can't say things about, certainly can't say anything about marriage equality or the healthcare system they created in Massachusetts. He can't talk about the things that actually would make him someone you might want to listen to because it's not palatable to an extreme wing of his party that has grown in size. And to me, that's what makes since the contract with America, on America, whatever it was called, like, I don't think Newt Gingrich had anything very productive to say. I think Romney, out of his experience, actually has some interesting things. And I'm also someone who has believed that there are good lessons in the private sector, not all of them, but some for public sector work and for nonprofit work. So I would actually be open to some of Governor Romney's ideas. And I think they would, right, it would be a healthy debate. He's just had to dump all of those. And I think the reason I would so much want there to be a healthy debate is, although as I mentioned, did I mention that I love the president? I did. In my new job, we have this investment committee because we have almost a $500 million endowment. So a big part of my job is making sure I don't lose it. And in their presentation about our investments, from an investment point of view, they said, unemployment's around 9%, underemployment takes you about 16%, and if you include those people who have stopped looking, it's about 25%, 1 in 4 adults are under, or not looking for work. Well, that is a broken economy. And I don't believe in this political context or with the people surrounding this president, they actually know what to do about this economy. And that's why if you had a healthy debate of people legitimately thinking about, we have a serious problem. Like the prosperity of America has, I believe, allowed the democracy of America to thrive. Right? The idea that you could expand the promise of America and welcome more people into the American dream was because people believed those people we used to keep out could get more and my kids could still get more.
Yeah, right.
And if you're sure that your kids aren't going to get more, why would you let new people in? It's like it's against your most tightly held value, your children's future. And so we need a healthy debate about what to do about this economy or the whole project, right? The whole democratic endeavor of this country. It can't succeed unless we figure out what to do with this economy. And I don't think, because of ideological reasons and because of sort of narrow frameworks of what's possible, I don't think we're doing it. So for those reasons, I would love a set of Republican candidates to really provoke a healthy debate, but I don't think they're doing it.
Can I just for 1 second, I could hear you guys talk all day. This is amazing. But what I do want to say is let's have one more question, and I think we're going to start coming to collect your questions in a minute. So please write on your index cards during this last back and forth, and then Jen can come around in a few minutes and collect those, and we'll continue the conversation with your questions as well.
So I've always thought it was interesting that Republican candidates do have to become more conservative. I mean, John McCain of 2000 would not vote for the John McCain of 2008. Right. He would not have. But let me just, since this is going to be the last kind of question, I just want to make sure that you get the chance to. What did you come here tonight to tell these folks? Mm-hmm. What's the gist? What's the takeaway piece that made you fly from New York City to Seattle, Washington? And you told me earlier you're flying back tomorrow morning. So that's a big commitment. What did you come to tell these people? Mm-hmm.
So I think that it's not a joke. 25% unemployment, a split in our politics that fractures along religious lines, an angry and growing white working class that sees no future for itself. It's like perilous circumstances in a lot of ways. That's not what I came to tell you, though. And a Jewish community that has opted out of this conversation. We've decided that, we're a one-trick pony. Right? It is about politics in the Middle East. That is what we are going to do. And everything from political strategy to the demographics of the next 50 years to what I believe is our ethical code tells me that that is the wrong move for the American Jewish community. And I feel this, I told you a little about my family's own story. I feel this, I keep saying I'm on a crusade, and I think, I'm not supposed to say that in a Jewish crowd. But I feel like I will go anywhere to remind us that we have, I'm not like a particularist in this way. I don't think the Jewish tradition is better than others. But I was born into this one. And I think it has some very unique wisdom to offer the world. Like I think the Exodus story, right? That's our story. And everybody uses it for their revolutionary social change movements. So it has something to say about what we need. And there's more, obviously, to Judaism than Exodus, though not a lot more. I feel like every single person here could decide in their own life in some way to bring that Jewish value set back into the public square. So that, about 15 years ago, I was working in Washington, D.C., and I went to this, 900 people showed up for this accountability session with the mayor, African-American Mayor Williams, and 3 black pastors kind of led the event. And we went down to the church basement afterwards, like 20 of us, to debrief the night. And we went around and said, what was the biggest success? And the mayor had agreed to all their demands. And I was like, we won. The mayor did what we wanted. And the 3 black pastors sort of looked at me together and said, no, the big success of the night was the Jews were here. And I looked at him, I was like, it was like 14 Jews. I go, really? He said, in this country, this goes from a particular struggle of one community, sort of a self-interested community, to a struggle of righteousness when the Jewish community pays attention. That's the place you hold in this country. And I thought, it may be true or it may not be true, but to the extent it is true, we live in a moment in time where we cannot afford to withhold that position that we've arrived at for all sorts of strange reasons in this society. And we can blame it on this or that or the institutions or this. But the truth is, like, on some level, not to be sort of hyperbolic, the nation hangs in the balance. The question is, will people, through their own root, their own tradition, their own approach, their own ethical frame, decide to help America live up to its promise? Or we will retreat into our private communities and our personal lives and think we can manage the fallout privately. And I don't think we can, and I think Judaism teaches us again and again to come together for the public solution, not retreat to the private solution. So that would be, I think that's probably why I came.
One quick follow-up on that. In doing that, bringing those values in the public arena, are you looking for a declaration of the people that do that, that it is a Jewish set of values? Do you want that to be said? Do you want that explicit, or is it enough to merely show up and bring those values?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I believe, at the end of the day, I think the first order of business is we need more people committed to and acting every day to change the world. And if Judaism gets you there, that's perfect. Right? If Buddhism gets you there, that's great for you too. But we need more people doing that. So I'll take it if you just show up with those values in here. But I believe, because of the particular history of this people and the particular confluence of, we are endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights. We are made in the image of God, right? The confluence of our teachings and the religion of America, the constitutional religion of America, like, there is something special about this place and this people in this place. And so I think we don't bring our full potential to the struggles of the day if we hold back the Jewish. So ultimately, I think if we want to contribute the most we can, it will be because we're proudly vocal about why Jews are doing this.